Welcome to Mill History Talk, the podcast where strategy meets storytelling, unpacking the drama, decisions, and disasters of war so you understand not just what happened, but why it still matters. The views expressed on Mill History Talk are those of the hosts, writers, and guests, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any government agency, military organization, or institution. This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. What if I told you that millions of people can oppose a regime and still never rise up? Not because they agree, not because they're weak, but because the system makes revolt impossible. Today, we're going to examine one of the clearest examples of that idea: Nazi Germany. Hey everyone, welcome back to Mill History Talk. I'm Hope, and this is episode 65. Today's episode is a little different. We're not looking at a battle, or a campaign, or even a decision. We're looking at a question that sits underneath all of those things. Why don't people revolt against a totalitarian regime? Because we tend to assume they will, that at some point, pressure builds, conditions worsen, and people act. But history doesn't always work that way. So today, we're going to slow that assumption down and examine Nazi Germany as a case study in how a system can suppress not just resistance, but the conditions that make collective resistance possible at all.
And that distinction is critical. This is not a case of a population without opposition. Opposition existed at many levels and across different groups. The question is why that opposition never became coordinated, why it never scaled, and what that tells us about the relationship between power, structure, and human behavior.
So let's start by reframing the problem. We often think of revolt as a reaction. People are pushed, and eventually, they push back. But that assumes something important, that people can act together. And that's not automatic.
No, it isn't. Revolt is not simply an emotional response. It is a structural outcome. It requires the ability to organize, communicate, coordinate, and trust. Without those elements, even widespread dissatisfaction remains isolated.
So instead of asking, why didn't people resist, we should be asking, could they have resisted collectively given the conditions they were in?
And in Nazi Germany, those conditions were removed early, systematically, and with lasting effect.
Now here's where the system becomes more sophisticated. Because control doesn't come from watching everyone. It comes from making people believe they might be watched.
The regime's security apparatus was not large enough to monitor the entire population directly. Instead, it relied on denunciation, on information provided by ordinary citizens.
Which changes everything. Because now the system isn't just external, it's social.
Yes, surveillance becomes decentralized, embedded in everyday life. And that produces a critical effect. It erodes trust.
And without trust, you cannot form networks. You cannot test ideas. You cannot even safely ask, do you see what I see?
And over time, individuals adapt. They self-censor. They avoid risk. They behave as if they are being watched, even when they are not.
And that's enough. Because collective action doesn't require total repression to fail. It only requires enough uncertainty to prevent coordination. So resistance still exists. But it takes a different form. It becomes small, localized, disconnected.
And this creates a structural dilemma. If a group remains small, it may survive. If it expands, it increases the risk of exposure.
So growth becomes dangerous, and survival requires isolation.
Which prevents scaling. And without scaling, there is no mass movement.
And that's the critical point. Resistance doesn't fail because it disappears. It fails because it cannot connect. And this is where the examples really matter. Because resistance is not theoretical. It exists. And in some cases, it's remarkably bold. But it doesn't translate into something larger.
The assassination attempt by Georg Elser in 1939 is one of the clearest examples. He acts alone, he plans carefully, he demonstrates both technical skill and strategic awareness. And yet, the attempt remains isolated.
There's no network behind it. No organization ready to act if it succeeds. No broader structure to absorb the shock of the event and turn it into momentum. So even a high-impact act doesn't produce follow-on action.
And that's the key limitation. Individual action, even when effective, cannot substitute for organizational capacity. Without structure, there is no mechanism to expand the effect.
And we see the same pattern at lower levels. Everyday resistance exists across society. People listen to foreign broadcasts. They tell jokes. They express quiet dissent in small circles.
But these acts remain private or semi-private. They do not circulate widely. They do not connect groups. They do not create shared awareness.
So they don't accumulate. They don't build pressure in a coordinated way. They don't create a sense that others are acting too. And without that, there's no tipping point.
Exactly. Momentum requires visibility and connection. In this system, both are constrained.
So resistance exists, but it never becomes a movement. Now we need to go deeper into something that's easy to overlook. Because it's not just about what the regime does, it's about how people respond to it.
Yes, individuals don't simply react emotionally. They evaluate their situation. They make calculations, often under conditions of uncertainty.
And those calculations are shaped by a few basic questions. What happens to me if I act? What happens to my family? And most importantly, will it make a difference?
And in this environment, the answers tend to converge. The risks are high, the consequences are severe, and the probability of success appears low.
So even people who are deeply uncomfortable, even people who disagree, may decide not to act. Not because they support the system, but because resistance appears irrational.
And this is reinforced by selective repression. Not all individuals experience the regime in the same way. Some are targeted directly, others are not.
Which means the perception of danger is uneven. And that matters, because collective action requires a shared sense of urgency.
Without that, people do not align their behavior. They respond individually.
And early on, there are also perceived benefits: economic recovery, stability, national success.
Which complicates decision-making, because now individuals are weighing risk of resistance against perceived gains from compliance.
And for many, the conclusion is the same. The cost of acting is immediate and severe. The benefit is uncertain.
Which leads to a pattern of passive accommodation, not ideological support, but calculated inaction.
And when enough individuals make that same calculation, collective action becomes even less likely. So, what happens when the system comes under pressure? When the war turns? When losses mount?
We might expect those conditions to trigger revolt. Historically, crises often do. But in this case, they don't.
And that's where structure matters again, because by this point, the underlying conditions haven't changed.
The networks are still gone. Trust is still degraded. Surveillance is still embedded.
So even as dissatisfaction grows, it remains fragmented. People may recognize that something is wrong, but they cannot coordinate a response.
And there's another factor: uncertainty about what comes next. Collapse is not a neutral outcome. It introduces risk.
Fear of instability, fear of violence, fear of what replaces the current system.
And that uncertainty works against collective action, because coordination requires not just opposition, but a shared expectation of the future.
And without that, people hesitate. They wait. They withdraw.
So crisis increases discontent, but does not produce organization.
And without organization, there is no uprising. Now we need to spend some time on what is probably the most well-known attempt to overthrow the Nazi regime from within: the July 20th plot. Because on the surface, this looks like the moment where everything should have come together. You have senior military officers, you have planning, you have access to the center of power, and you have a clear objective: remove Hitler and trigger a collapse of the regime.
Yes, and in many ways, this is the most serious coordinated attempt to overthrow the regime. It involves high-ranking officers, elements of the reserve army, and a plan, Operation Valkyrie, to seize control of the state apparatus once Hitler is eliminated. From a purely operational perspective, it is not poorly conceived.
Right. This isn't random resistance. This is structured. It's organized. It's deliberate. So the question becomes, why does it fail?
It fails for several reasons, but the most important one is structural. The plot depends on a critical assumption that removing Hitler will create an opportunity for broader action, that the population, or at least key institutions, will respond.
That something larger will follow, that the system will unravel, that others will step in.
And that assumption proves incorrect, because by 1944, the conditions required for coordinated response do not exist.
There are no independent networks, no functioning civil institutions, no shared communication channels.
And critically, no trust structure that allows individuals or groups to align quickly. Even within the military, support is uneven and uncertain.
So when the attempt fails and Hitler survives, there is no second layer, no fallback, no broader movement ready to activate.
And even before that, coordination is already fragile. Orders are delayed, information is incomplete, key actors hesitate.
Because they're calculating. They don't know if the plan has succeeded. They don't know who is committed. They don't know who might turn on them.
Exactly. And that uncertainty, which is built into the system, prevents decisive action.
So instead of rapid consolidation, you get hesitation, fragmentation, delay.
And in a system like this, delay is fatal, because the regime retains control of communication, security forces, and coercive capacity.
So once the moment passes, it closes quickly, and then the system does what it's designed to do.
It responds decisively. Thousands are arrested. Executions follow. Networks, such as they are dismantled further.
And this is where the deeper point becomes clear. Even this level of resistance, even with access, planning, and intent, cannot overcome the structural conditions.
Because the plot is not connected to a mass base. It is not embedded in society. It does not have the ability to mobilize beyond its immediate circle.
And that's the key limitation. It's not just about removing leadership. It's about what happens next.
And what happens next requires networks, communication, trust, shared intent, all of which are absent.
So even if the assassination had succeeded, There is no guarantee, and in fact, very little likelihood, that it would have triggered a mass uprising.
Because the population is not positioned to respond collectively. The system has spent over a decade ensuring that.
And that's what makes this so important. The failure of the July 20 plot is not just the failure of a plan. It's the failure of structure.
Yes, it demonstrates that even elite coordination cannot substitute for the absence of collective capacity.
So what we're seeing here is not just a missed opportunity. It's a system that has already removed the possibility of follow-on action.
And that's why this matters, because it reinforces the central argument. Resistance can exist, even at high levels, and still fail to produce change.
Because without structure, it cannot scale. And without scaling, there is no revolt. So when we step back from the case, what do we actually learn? Because this isn't just about Nazi Germany. It's about how power works.
The central insight is structural. Revolt is not a natural outcome of oppression. It is dependent on the presence of specific conditions.
And those conditions are fragile. They can be removed. They can be targeted.
And in this case, they were. Deliberately. Systematically.
So opposition exists, but it cannot align. It cannot coordinate. It cannot act collectively.
And without that, there is no mechanism for scaling, no pathway from dissent to action.
And that changes how we interpret absence, because the absence of revolt is not evidence of agreement. It is evidence of constraint.
Constraint built into the structure of the system. A system designed not just to punish dissent, but to prevent it from becoming collective.
And that may be the most important point. The regime doesn't just suppress resistance. It prevents the conditions that make resistance possible.
Which makes revolt not unlikely, but structurally improbable.
And that's a very different way of understanding what we're seeing. Not a failure of will, but a failure of structure. So here's the takeaway for episode 65. Opposition can exist across an entire society and still never become action. Because without structure, it cannot become collective.
We've included additional readings on resistance and totalitarian systems in the show notes and on our Substack. Because understanding outcomes in history requires understanding the conditions that produce them.
As always, thanks for listening. See you next time.